Autofire. The dominant view in the Shmup community is that Autofire is good because it allows you to play games while reducing stress on your fingers. And while this is fair enough for most shooters, especially more modern ones, it is by no means a truism. A while ago I was talking with O5Pro on Twitter about why I think Autofire can be problematic in older games. While Twitter is a great website for networking, the 250 character limit makes it a pretty awful platform for expressing nuanced ideas. I felt like I wasn't really able to explain my opinion properly, so I figured I'd make a video to clarify my thoughts. But as I got to thinking about it more, it became clear to me that while Autofire can definitely be overpowered in certain contexts, developers trying to find their way around this problem was actually the catalyst that led to evolution in the genre. Let's go back to the beginning. In early shooters, Autofire was a non-issue, because it didn't exist yet. But still, it wouldn't provide much use even when applied to the games of the early 80s. This is because shooting games like Capcom's 1942 had an extremely low rate of fire. Since you could only have 3 of your own shots on screen at any given time, it was important to line up your attacks with precision, as missing an enemy could quickly put you into a disadvantaged state. In such a game, Autofire would do more harm than good, since it would rob you of this precision without actually increasing your rate of fire. But now, let's look at 1990's Raiden. On the left is me fighting the stage 1 boss without Autofire, and on the right is me fighting the boss with 30Hz Autofire, which means Autofire that shoots at 30 button presses per second. Notice how Autofire allows me to destroy the boss much faster than I possibly can without it. This means that I do not have to deal with the boss's next attack pattern. Autofire lets me perform something that I literally cannot do without it, and therefore allows me to defeat the boss using an entirely different tactic. In this context, it is impossible to say that Autofire is just reducing hand fatigue, as the clips literally prove otherwise. Now, that isn't to say that Autofire is universally overpowered, even within the context of Raiden. Using 30Hz Autofire would still be disadvantageous at times. This is because the benefits of Autofire can only be achieved when point-blanking enemies due to the game's shot limit. Using 30Hz Autofire at a distance is actually weaker for similar reasons to 1942. The on-screen shot limit cannot match the Autofire rate. Therefore, it leaves large gaps in your bullets, which is not ideal for taking down waves of Zucco enemies. So, is Autofire broken? Is it cheating? In a competitive sense, no. The shooting game community understands that Autofire and non-Autofire scores aren't directly comparable, which is why high scoreboards are traditionally separated for the two. You can't really be accused of cheating if you're playing on the same terms as your opponents, after all. But since it can significantly change the routing in earlier games that weren't designed with Autofire in mind, I would argue that it's not a very genuine way to experience these games. These days, Autofire is not just the norm for Westerners, but also for Japanese arcade players. If you look at this post of various Darius cabinet setups at Taito Hey, taken by Alex Rushdie on Twitter, you can observe this. But would any cabinets have had Autofire buttons back when the first Darius game came out in early 1987? Probably not. You see, Autofire wasn't something invented by game developers, but rather arcade operators. The question is, when did it become popularized, and when did developers start taking it into account? As a Westerner who doesn't speak Japanese, it's difficult to find primary sources on this topic. But according to O5Pro, who has proven himself to be extremely knowledgeable on all topics related to arcade gaming, it became normalized sometime in 1987. This implies that most of the games that came out that year, as well as everything that came out in the years prior, was not designed with Autofire in mind. While the exact date of 1987 might be debatable, the idea is backed up by Jalico game designer Tadaaki Moriya. In the Shooting Game Site interview, which I've referenced multiple times now, he specifically talks about how Autofire presented a balancing issue for him when he was developing Gracia Second Earth, but says nothing of the sort in regards to 1989's Plus Alpha. But regardless of the exact time it happened, Autofire did eventually become the standard in Japanese arcades. And it was in response to this that developers started balancing their games accordingly. In 1990, Taito released Gun Frontier, which was, as far as I'm aware, the first game that increased the difficulty level when the player used a high rate of Autofire. Games like 1991's Earth Defense Force opted for a different route, where the fire rate was actually very low, but each shot resulted in a huge stream of bullets. This ensured that high rates of Autofire wouldn't actually give the player an advantage in terms of damage output. There are many more examples, but doesn't the fact that developers added mechanics to nerf the power of Autofire in the first place suggest that Autofire changed their game's design in ways that they didn't intend? I would say yes. But this industry trend was one that was ultimately good for the evolution of the genre. Because if not for the Autofire issue, we would have never gotten some of the best shooters ever made. If Taito hadn't come up with their rank system to weaken Autofire in Gun Frontier, we would have never gotten the blueprints Rising used to make Battle Gurega. If Psycho didn't identify point-blanking enemies as too powerful, we would have never gotten the melee system used in games like Gunbird 2. Hell, maybe Cave would never have come up with their tap to fire, hold to beam mechanic that would become a staple. And these are some of the best games and most entertaining mechanics in the entire genre. And that's all well and good. It's just that most shooting game players now, myself included, come from this more modern era where autofire has always been the norm. Looking at a mid-90s shooter like Game Tengoku, it's extremely obvious judging from both the maximum rate of fire and enemy resilience that it was designed with autofire in mind. Even destroying standard enemies becomes difficult without it, but you're going to run into some issues when you take a modern mentality and superimpose it over old school game design. If you're looking to check out some classics from the mid to late 80s, I would definitely suggest using a lower rate of autofire or even ditching it entirely. It's certainly given me a better understanding of that era's game design. But at the end of the day, it's your time and your decision as to which control method you prefer. I just feel like you're robbing yourself out of the genuine experience. From a historical perspective, the difficulty lies in determining exactly when autofire was being considered by shooting game developers. While I gave the example of how autofire can significantly change the routing of Raiden, as a 1990 release it's very possible that Saibu were aware of this and that they completely intended for players to destroy the first boss before it could even fire a shot. In lieu of primary sources, I have some circumstantial evidence. The Japanese Shooting Game Difficulty Wiki. This is a community compiled list that ranks every arcade shooter by difficulty. We can see that 1989's USAAF Mustang is rated a 33 out of 50, but noted is that it's 8 points easier with autofire. 1987's Kyoku Tiger is listed as being 10 points easier with autofire. Now, the exact numbers themselves might be arbitrary, but pretty much everyone who plays these games agrees that autofire makes them significantly easier. Whereas you never find this kind of discrepancy in the shooters of the 90s or 2000s. Why not? The implication is that by that time, virtually all shooting games were designed with autofire in mind and balanced accordingly, which also makes sense when you take into account the design changes I mentioned earlier. But it's hard to know with complete certainty. If anyone has any primary sources on this topic, or there are any veterans who want to share their stories of what arcade shmupping was like back in the 80s, I'd love to hear about it in the comments section. Before I end the video, there's a couple of things you might be wondering. First of all, why am I so concerned with preserving developer-intended game balance? Well, I'm actually not. After all, unintended mechanics can be extremely fun and sometimes make games better, like special cancels in Street Fighter 2. The issue for me is that autofire is external rather than internal, or in other words it is due to a hardware modification rather than an exploit within the game's code. Secondly, why did arcade operators invent autofire in the first place? Doesn't it seem strange that arcade operators would proliferate autofire when it made their games easier, considering that arcades relied on games being difficult for their income? Well, yeah, but players liked autofire, so adding it to your cabinets would give you an edge over your competition and allow you to steal customers from other arcades. Therefore, everyone else had to adopt it in order to avoid losing business. I hope that explains it. Thanks for watching.